Hello everyone, and welcome to session number 2 of our course called Exploring Daniel When God Invades a Broken World. I'm so glad you're with us today. We're going to look at the big picture. Last week we looked at the historical context in which Daniel was written, and now we want to take a look at the bigger story being told. So often when we look at Daniel, we get focused on one of the particulars in that book, like the stories of deliverance, or maybe the statue, or the beasts, or the times, and half a time, the 77s. These different topics kind of demand our attention. But if we're not careful, we get focused on the trees and we miss the forest. And there's a beautiful forest out there for us to explore. Daniel is a carefully organized treatment of subjects, and we want to look at that bigger treatment today. So we prepared a little diagram for you to look at. It's in our handout. You should see a link to it in our comment section if you're watching this on YouTube. It's our attempt to put some structure or to reflect the structure that's already there in the book. And so if we look at that diagram, we see, first of all, if we look at the beginning, the top left and the top right, we have kind of a mirrored set of bookends. We start the story, Babylon won. It has won. It's defeated Jerusalem. Daniel is being taken into exile with his compatriots. And now the faithful are called to suffer for what we learn to be at least these 70 years of captivity. But if we jump ahead to the end of the story, we see the exact opposite. The situation has entirely reversed. By the end of the story, God wins. The exile is ended and the faithful are delivered. So the whole story is told in between these mirrored bookends. You can tell right from the outset that this is a carefully organized story about how we get from here to there. Now let's look at the bottom of the diagram to that tan strip containing the words Hebrew and Aramaic. Daniel, as we have it, was composed in two different languages. It starts off in biblical Hebrew, and then in chapter 2, verse 4, it switches to Aramaic. The story then continues in Aramaic to the end of chapter 7. Then in chapter 8, it picks up again in biblical Hebrew. There have been several theories about why these two languages were used. Some people suggest that it has to do with sources, that there was an Aramaic source that was used and a Hebrew source that was used, and an editor put these together into one composition. It could be true, but the important point here is to notice the way in which the same story is being told and the same themes are interwoven between them. We can see how these threads go all the way through the story. And what's interesting to note here is within that story, the section told in Aramaic, chapters 2 through 7, it seems to focus specifically on the nations of the world. There are kings involved here from the nations of the world that are doing the oppressing. To Nebuchadnezzar, to Belshazzar, to Darius, they're all in this section. And God seems to be speaking directly here to these nations in a language they would understand. Aramaic was the international trade language of the day. It was the language probably spoken most often in the courts of Babylon. This was meant to say categorically that God is sovereign over these nations. He deals directly with these sovereigns. It is a message for the world. And within that message, God makes sure that they understand He will care for His people, to Daniel and his compatriots. And then when we switch again to chapter 8, we are more focused on God's chosen people. There's a story about them. The details about how God will work through His chosen people become more clear. So it's entirely possible that this Aramaic section is not just the accident of using a different source, but that it's part of the very plan and theology of the book. It's a message for the world at large. Now let's go back to the diagram itself, back to the top. And notice that across the top, the bridge between the front half cover, and the back half cover, the opening cover, and the last cover, the bridge, has these three visions. The visions found in chapters 2, 7, and 8. These are the three key visions of the story. They are the main anchors around which the rest of the story is hung. The first vision is a dream given to Nebuchadnezzar about the statue and God's sovereignty over that statue, and how that statue will one day be toppled by God's power, and the kingdom represented in this rock will extend throughout the world. Then we get a series of narratives that illustrate this point. The statue vision, it's all about God's sovereignty over the world. That's a fact being placed out there as a statement of fact. And then what we see over the next several chapters is God proving that fact in that day and in that time to that people in the Aramaic language. We see it in a very organized way. First, we see the message in chapter 3 of God's sovereignty over the situation and God's protection of his people. It is the story of Daniel's compatriots being placed in the fire and God rescuing them from that fire. It's a strong symbol that the fire that the people of God are now going through, God is there. He will rescue them. And the story ends with the dream that that Nebuchadnezzar has about this tree. And Daniel interprets it for him, that the tree is Nebuchadnezzar himself, and in judgment that tree will be cut down. And that's the statement that he will be cut down as a stump, and the period is given of 7 times. And then we are shown the fulfillment of that prophecy. For these 7 times, perhaps 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar is insane, but his sanity is eventually restored. And the whole chapter is a letter from Nebuchadnezzar attesting the power of God from the voice of the king of Babylon himself, a powerful illustration, a proof of this truth that God is sovereign. Then we see that cycle repeated in the inverse order. In chapter 5, we have another story of God's invasion into a ruler's life. This time it's Belshazzar, remember, the son of Nebuchadnezzar's successor. In this particular case, the story does not turn out well. Belshazzar throws a banquet and takes some of the goblets and vessels that were stolen from the temple, and he uses them to entertain his guests. And God puts handwriting on the wall. And Daniel comes and interprets that handwriting, and basically he tells Belshazzar, you're at your end. Judgment is coming. And it's in that very year that Cyrus invades. And it's the end of Darius's life, or end of Belshazzar's life. But then we see God's engagement again with his own people. This time we're talking about the successor to Belshazzar. Now we're in the Persian period. Darius is in charge. Darius puts out this law, and Daniel violates the law, and so Daniel is thrown in the lion's den. There again, God rescues his people and opposes the ruler in charge. And in the end, Darius has to admit that Daniel's God really is God. It's proof again that God is sovereign over these nations. And then after that proof, we have a repetition of the vision. The vision that was given in chapter 2, the dream given to Nebuchadnezzar, is now given in more intense form in chapter 7 to Daniel himself. Especially, it starts to focus on a forward time, a time future from Daniel, where the oppression on God's people will be increased. And what will happen in that last period of time, where that last kingdom, before the rock comes and destroys the statue, that last section of time, what will happen there? A focus on that time. So we're set up in that vision now at the end of this Aramaic portion. We're set up for this vision for the whole world to be engaged. And then that vision is further developed now in chapter 8 as we revert to the biblical Hebrew. In chapter 8, that vision is more focused on the people of God. What is going to happen in that final kingdom or in that end time? That's the focus in that particular chapter. Then something very interesting happens. After that last vision, that last key vision, I should say, of chapter 8, we have an interlude. It's Daniel's prayer. It's that prayer where he asks about the end of the 70 years of captivity. But God gives him a vision of 77s. What will happen from that point forward? We get a story of how God will provide for his people. Remember, in the earlier cycles, we have these stories of God providing, delivering. In chapter 9, on that same parallel idea, we have Daniel praying for that deliverance. How will that happen? How will that occur? When will that occur? And what we get in response is 3 additional visions that lay out how this is going to happen, what is going to occur in the end. There is this revelation from this glorious man, and then this story of God's engagement in history again. We saw it in chapter 4 and chapter 5, where God got directly engaged in history. He causes Nebuchadnezzar to fall. He caused Belshazzar to fall. And now in chapter 11, we see this long history of rulers combating. And what we see is God's sovereignty working all the way through that. That's going somewhere. And that story ends then with chapter 12, which is that final book cover. So if you just step back for a moment, you see how amazing this story is. This is not a fragmented story cobbled together with a few nice thoughts about encouraging. No, this is a carefully woven story built in a very carefully organized structure to make this constant theological point, to reinforce God's sovereignty over the nations, but also God's faithfulness to his people. And it serves as the factual basis, if you will, the prophetic basis and the historic basis to call us to faithfulness, assured that God will stay engaged. Now that we've looked at the big picture of Daniel, and before we get into some of the details, I thought it might be helpful to discuss our approach, especially about some of the more difficult issues of interpretation. And we start with this subject of authorship and origins. When Jerome was translating the Bible into Latin in the 4th century AD, when he finished the book of Daniel, he referenced in the prologue the fact that there were already doubts about the traditional view. At least one church leader had already begun arguing that the book was written much later than the 6th century BC, not in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, but much later in the 2nd century BC, around the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, in around perhaps 165 BC. The idea there is that in a culture that was more comfortable with myth and legend and synonymous writing, in other words, writing written in another person's name, someone was using those literary genres to make a point. They were taking stories from the past and trying to motivate and inspire those who were fighting back against the Hellenizing policies of Antiochus. So that became the theory of many interpreters and is certainly a popular theory today. Now, it's beyond the scope of this video to discuss this authorship question in more detail. But I did want to mention a piece of documentary evidence that shed some light on the subject. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a fragment of Daniel has been found containing portions of a few verses from Daniel 10. Most people date that fragment from somewhere between 150 and 100 BC. This would put it within 15 to 65 years of the proposed date of composition. In other words, if the book were truly written around 165 BC, then within 15 or 65 years, this book would have had to have been translated, handed down, preserved by the desert community, revered by the desert community. And by itself, this is not conclusive evidence, but there are actually several copies of Daniel's found. And it seems as though Daniel may have been revered not just as another book of reference, but as sacred scripture. So it's an obvious question. Was Daniel revered as scripture? And if so, what would have presented itself to them as authoritative scripture? A book written in the 6th century BC, or one written within the last 50 or 60 years? It's a valid question to be asked. The other thing I would say is that there's tremendous historical agreement between extra-biblical sources and the book of Daniel about the 6th century. Now, I realize there are questions and tensions and concerns, but there's nothing there that is mutually exclusive. I think there are pieces of missing evidence, things that can be found. But on balance, viewing all the evidence together, I actually think the argument for an older 6th century date is more convincing than that of a 2nd century BC date. But of course, smarter people disagree. I'll leave you to sort through and make your own conclusions. Next, as we consider our approach to the book of Daniel, I thought it might be helpful to say a word or two about symbols and how we can interpret these symbols. Obviously, there are symbols or images throughout the book of Daniel, and we really have a challenge here. On one hand, we want to do justice to those symbols. I mean, they are there for a reason. They're meant to convey meaning. They're meant to say something to us about history, about the future. So we definitely want to respect the integrity of the symbols that are used. But we also have to guard against reading too much into them. We don't want to bring our own understanding and our own viewpoints into those symbols. We have to let those symbols talk to us. We don't want to morph them into what we already think they believe. There's a difference, I think, between interpreting the symbols and speculating about them. You know, when we look at a good piece of art, people who really know what they're doing, they know what the author is communicating or trying to communicate. But the less you really respect the integrity of the author, the more you can interpret that art to mean anything you want it to mean. And we have that in the interpretation of Daniel. There are people who just speculate all over the place about what these symbols could mean. They just draw all sorts of random conclusions. I think we have to be really faithful to the integrity of the original author. What were they seeking to say? They're using symbols. They're not speaking in concrete language. They're not giving us names all the time and places and dates. They're using symbols for a reason. What is it they're seeking to convey? And how do we get to that answer without reading too much into the symbols? That's the challenge before us. Now, quite often, these symbols in the book of Daniel have to do with images and kingdoms. And what's interesting in this case is that sometimes the author gives us explicit references. We have just enough to get us started, just enough to start us down the trail. We find it explicitly in Daniel chapter 2, in the story of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees. The interpreter tells Daniel, and Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold is explicitly a reference to Nebuchadnezzar. He is that head of gold. So there we have a concrete reference of the symbol. Later, we learn the same thing about the tree, the dream of the tree that Nebuchadnezzar has in chapter 4. We are told explicitly, you are the tree, right? That's the statement that Daniel can make to him. The next two times we get an explicit reference like that, it's all the way in chapter 8, and it has to do with the two-horned ram, and we're told that that two-horned ram are the kings of Media and Persia. And then in that same chapter, the very next verse, we are told that the shaggy goat references Greece. Those are the only 4 times in the book of Daniel where we get explicit references that tell us this is what the symbol means. All those other symbols, they somehow have to be hung off those explicit references. Now, there's another example here. There is in chapter 11 this long string of kings that are called the king of the north and the king of the south. And it turns out not to be one king, but really a line of kings in the north, which turns out to be the Seleucid Empire mostly, and the kings of the south that turns out to be Egypt mostly. Those are the kings that are there. So it's one name, but they refer to multiple kings. So that sort of is an explicit reference. Beyond those explicit references, we are really left to our own. And I think that the key here is that we don't attach too much authority to our interpretations. There is a reason why those interpretations are left open. We have to follow the story a little bit to determine what they represent. Let's not attach to our identifications as divinely ordained or divinely spoken. God gives us a few places to start. The book gives us a few places to start. Let's be confident where the scripture is really, really clear and explicit, and then let's back off. Let's add some more caution when we start going beyond those symbols into these other places, and only go as far as clear logic will take us. Beyond that, let's recognize that we are in the range of guessing. We're trying to figure out, and we are trying to assert certainty where God has not given us certainty, and we need to be conscious of those limits. Now, we also have the challenge of numbers in this book of Daniel, and numbers can be tricky. They really can be explicit, very concrete things. And sometimes context gives us a clue. We can tell from context. For example, in the very first chapter, we're told about this plan of Nebuchadnezzar to assign this training program, to assign Daniel and his compatriots to this training program that lasts 3 years. Okay, the context tells us that we probably ought to interpret that very, very literally. I mean, this is a 3-year period. But even literal numbers, then we have to decide whether or not they're exact numbers or round numbers. You know, in our scientific culture, we want all exact. Exactly 3, exactly 7. When's the starting date? When's the ending date? Or is round numbers kind of a way of doing business in that culture? If it says 3 years, does it have to be exactly 3 years from midnight to midnight? Or can there be some round numbers involved? And we see that, for example, in the whole 70 years of captivity. There are interpreters that have tried to measure this from date to date. It starts to press credulity, I think. They get that precise. This year, 70 years, it's meant to be a round number. It's about that time. I think that's why Daniel is praying when he prays in the time just before Darius comes, right on the eve of Cyrus's arrival. It's just about that time that Daniel says, I think the time is about up. So I do think when we deal with numbers, we have to be willing to admit sometimes they're round numbers, not necessarily precise minute-to-minute numbers. That may be more of a modern or postmodern obsession than it was an ancient obsession. So in addition to this area of round numbers, we have to think that sometimes the numbers point beyond themselves to another level of reality. Numbers are a window into the heavens. Some numbers, they just point beyond. So we see this in Daniel chapter 9 again. I mean, Daniel's praying about 70 years, and the heavenly messenger says, well, that's 70 years. It's really meant to point beyond to a 77s. So numbers really, the way they're piled on top of one another, they're meant to take us from one place to another place, to think of things from a different dimension. And then on top of that, you have the cultural layer. A cultural layer where certain numbers are inherently meaningful by themselves. And certainly this is the case of ancient Hebrew. Hebrew of this period, there's this understanding that certain numbers have a significance all to their own. So this number of 7 is one of those. I mean, 7 is a very symbolic number throughout Scripture. I mean, it all comes from 7 days of creation and the fact that the 7th day is the Sabbath day. And so seventh is this completion of a week, the completion of the creation, the completion. There's something about that seventh day that is the completion. And so it's hard to really read anything connected with a seven in it in its symbolic context and not think there's a cultural meaning, that this somehow has a relevance to the story. The number 10 is similar. In Daniel, we see this reference to 10 horns and 10 kingdoms. 10 is really another way of talking about completion and a fullness, right? I mean, you think about 10 fingers and 10 toes. When you have all your fingers and all your toes, this is about a complete, a full, a definition of full power. It's all there. So these numbers have a cultural significance. So when we're interpreting numbers, yes, they may be just literal numbers. They may be just measuring something from here to there. That's one possibility. But we have to be aware that there are multiple levels of meaning, perhaps, in numbers, not just conveying something concrete like 70 years. It may point beyond to something else, beyond giving us another window into another dimension. And then if you add to this the fact that these numbers carry cultural significance of completion and power and kind of the end of things, all of this has to be considered as when we start looking at these numbers as more than just measuring devices. And lastly, as we consider our approach to Daniel, I thought it might be helpful to look at a couple different interpretive perspectives. There are many different views of Daniel, ways to approach Daniel throughout history, all sorts of different viewpoints about what these kingdoms represent and what's going to happen in the future. And so I thought it might be helpful to kind of get a lay of the land on some of those perspectives and identify where we fit in all that. In my opinion, as you read through the history of commentaries, you can really divide opinion into two groups. One group, they're going down the pathway of it being written in the 6th century BC. They believe it's history. They believe it talks about history, that Daniel is a 6th century person, that the things it says about Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and Darius, that's all history. So that's one group, and they tend to interpret Daniel with a certain amount of shared assumptions. And then there's a second group that really sees it as a 2nd century BC document, and they have a different set of assumptions. So let's first look at the group that sees it as a 6th century document. As I said, they share a certain amount of assumptions that this is history, this is legitimate prophecy. Daniel is foreseeing into the future. They agree that at some point Jesus is coming back to set up his kingdom, that somehow the return of Jesus is embedded in the prophecy of Daniel. Now, where they begin to kind of part ways is with regard to how clearly that future is defined. There's one group of people that know that it is future in its orientation, but a lot is not clarified in Daniel, they believe. So the stories about history, about Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and Darius, all clear. But when we start looking forward to Antiochus and what happens beyond Antiochus, then there's kind of a difference of opinion. Some folks see a lot of the fulfillment in some of these visions happening around the time of Christ, the birth of Christ, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by Titus, things that happened subsequent to that in the Roman Empire. Different people believe different things, but they see a lot of what Daniel foresaw as having already been fulfilled from our perspective. Future from Daniel's perspective, but finished from our perspective. And there's still some things yet to be fulfilled. Christ still has to come back, but the visions of Daniel have largely been fulfilled. Or another take on that is that it's a cycle that repeats itself over and over again. It repeated itself in Daniel's time, in Jesus' time, and it continues to repeat itself throughout history. So that's one group that believe that Daniel was a 6th century product. And it goes by different names. And again, in your handouts, I have commentaries written from that perspective. The other group sees a clearer vision of what's happening in the future. Sometimes we call this group dispensationalist perspective. They believe that there's a very clear picture revealed in Daniel having to do with that 70th week. They, like the others who believe in a 6th century document, they believe up to a point history is described in Daniel. But that last kingdom, that last abomination of desolation, that 70 week of Daniel, that has not yet happened. That's pushed out into the future. We're in between the 69th week and the 70th week. There's still a 7-year period, and most folks in that camp believe it's a literal 7-year period. They call it the Great Tribulation. And at some point before, during, or after that Great Tribulation, Jesus is going to come and take the church out of it, depending on which group you're with. Either you're out of the tribulation, or you go through part of it, or you go through all of it. But the point is that it's out in the future. It's 7 years out there. And at that point, another ruler, a worldwide ruler known as the Antichrist, kind of the fuller incarnation of what we saw in Caesar, or what we saw in Nebuchadnezzar and Caesar and Antiochus. There'll be another worldwide empire that will persecute the people of God. There will be a new abomination of desolation. The temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, and that temple will be desecrated. So they see a very clear future outlined in the book of Daniel. So that's another perspective. And then there is the group of folks that see it as a 2nd century document. And they also you can divide them into two groups. One group still sees it as a divinely inspired document, just written later, and approving of this use of synonymous writing. It's using literature of the day, but it's still a God-ordained message of faithfulness, encouragement to faithfulness, to do what those who opposed Antiochus did, to do what those who opposed Nebuchadnezzar did. It's an exhortation to prove that God is still faithful. And then there's another group who sees this as a 2nd century document, who sees it more in terms of literature. It is literature like other literature of that period. We ought to compare it to other literature from that period, understand what it means from that perspective, and see it as kind of a human exhortation to good and faithful living. So different layers of meaning attached to Daniel based upon when you believe it was written and how inspired you believe it to be. And also how if you're going to believe it talks about our future, how precise do you think it is? And those are the questions that we have to look at as we work through the details of the book. Before we jump into the details of interpreting this book, I thought it might be helpful to say a few words about some extra material that's found in some translations of Daniel, but not in others. If you're from a Roman Catholic background or an Eastern Orthodox background, you will find portions in your version of Daniel that are not found in the Protestant version of the Bible. And the reason for that goes way back to pre-Christian days. In the days of the Greek Empire, where people from Judah are now being scattered throughout the world, not just in Babylon, but all throughout the world, and as Greek becomes the international language of commerce, there's a call that goes out for the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, to be translated into Greek. And one of the places that call is answered is in the city of Alexandria, a large Jewish population there. Scholars there took it to heart and rendered a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. Now, there's legendary accounts of that. We have to read between the lines and see exactly what happened. Sometimes that version is called the Septuagint. Other times it's called the Old Greek version. But in any case, it's an attempt to render the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Well, when they did this, they incorporated works in that collection that were not part of the original Hebrew scriptures. And yet they told more of the story, they added information, and so they were included in the Greek translation. They were written later, but nonetheless included as part of the larger story of the Hebrew world in this Greek culture. Later, this becomes a challenge when the Bible is translated into Latin. When Jerome is given this task for the Catholic Church to render the Bible into Latin, he has to make a decision about what to do about these extra works, these works that were not in the Hebrew scriptures, but yet they were included among the Greek translations. And by then they had become so popular that he was really not at liberty to just leave them out of this common version of the Bible that people were so used to. So he translated them and included them in what was called the Vulgate, or the common version of the Bible for the Catholic Church. For centuries, it was generally acknowledged that these were included, but not necessarily of the same authority as the rest of Scripture. Well, this becomes a problem during the period of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants being a little more of a stickler about some of these things, and also egged on by the fact that some of the practices in the Roman Catholic Church were supported by texts from some of this extra material. When the Protestant Bibles were produced, they left out this extra material. And that, of course, was not handled well in that particular period of time. The Roman Catholic Church pushed back hard against this, and they actually pronounced a curse, anathema, on people who did not accept this version of the scriptures. So there became this rift between Catholic churches and Protestant churches as to whether these books ought to be included, these portions of scripture ought to be included in the scriptures. Protestants usually refer to as the Apocrypha, books that were written later, that are written under a separate name. In any case, some of that shows up in the book of Daniel. There are three portions in particular that show up in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox versions of the scriptures. There is this prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Holy Children. It's inserted in the story of Daniel's compatriots in Daniel chapter 3. It's the prayer of one of those compatriots to God in the midst of the fiery furnace. There are two other stories added to the end of the Latin version of the scriptures, and the modern translations, the Catholic version, Eastern Orthodox tradition, they usually occur as chapters 13 and 14 at the end of Daniel. One is the story of Susanna and the elders, a young virtuous woman that's accused falsely of adultery, and Daniel is called as the judge to exonerate her, and through his wisdom he exonerates this person. And then the last story, Bel and the Dragon, it's kind of three different narratives that show how Daniel overcomes the Bel, this Babylonian god, the dragon, who's also features in the Babylonian pantheon, how Daniel has given power over these figures. So generally seen as later works, as more mythological, legendary works. Now, for those who see Daniel as a 2nd century product, they just see this as all part of the same period. That is, this literature and the rest of Daniel, all part of the same genre, so they kind of interpret it as part of the story. For those like us, however, who see this as a 6th century, the main part of Daniel as a 6th century document, we will see these additions as later additions that were not part of the original story. So what that means for our class here is we're going to leave those on the side. You can look them up on the internet and read them. They are interesting reading, but we will not include them as part of our discussion of the interpretation of Daniel. Sometimes you hear Daniel referred to as apocalyptic literature. Well, what does that mean? Well, literally, the word just means a revelation of something that was previously hidden. But over time, the word has broadened to include a particular kind of literature. In fact, some people argue, those like ourselves who believe that Daniel was written in the 6th century BC, some people argue that it's one of the original forms of apocalyptic literature. And by the way, as people talk about this, I haven't found complete agreement on what apocalyptic literature is or is not. But generally speaking, it refers to a kind of literature that has some things in common. On one level, it means that the message is always conveyed in some sort of vivid, highly pictorial, symbolic language. A lot of visions, word pictures are drawn. It's not straightforward didactic communication. It's communication through symbols and word pictures, fantastic pictures that stretch and defy the imagination. And usually it's a message conveyed by a heavenly messenger. This is the gods, or in this case, God, speaking to earth. So it's a heavenly messenger that comes and brings the message. It is a revelation. It's not something deduced by human insight and human logic. It has to be revealed from above. And usually there are cosmic consequences from all this. There's a struggle between heaven and earth and the underworld, that there's a battle going on behind the earthly battles, that there's spiritual forces behind all this, and there's collisions going on. And it shows us the behind the scenes battles that are happening behind the earthly battles. And usually the emphasis is upon the outcome, the final product, the end. And this is certainly true of biblical apocalyptic literature. And I should indicate that there are various kinds of apocalyptic literature. There's secular apocalyptic literature out there that has nothing whatsoever to do with God. It's simply the end of the world, doomsday kind of stuff. But ancient apocalyptic literature, like the kind we're speaking about here, it is about God speaking through that. It is the spiritual dimension behind the earthly reality. And the other thing about apocalyptic literature is it always kind of has this double side to it. It reveals, yes, it's intended to be a revelation. It's intended to tell us something, but it remains hidden. There are pieces that are not disclosed. Almost on purpose, there's stuff being held back. There's still mystery that we don't yet understand. Well, that certainly describes Daniel, all these things. Yes, there's a message of vivid, highly pictorial symbols in here, word pictures. There's all kinds of heavenly messengers revealing this to Daniel. There is a cosmic struggle going on. We hear Michael struggling with the Prince of Persia, these things going on behind the scenes. That's happening. It is a focus on the end of time, the time and a half of time. How is this going to come out in the end? So that's apocalyptic. The outcome is certainly there. And the last is true. We learn many, many things through Daniel. There's many things revealed from heaven. But there's also some mystery, some things that we will not understand, even by the end of the book. So I look forward to unwinding that stuff with you as we continue our study in Daniel. As we conclude this session on the big picture, let's ask the all-important question, what's the point? What's the point of this big picture we've just examined? It's all about the sovereignty of God and the faithfulness of God revealed in these three key visions in chapters 2, 7, and 8. In chapter 2 comes the promise of God's victory over the kingdoms of the world, the rock that will topple the statue and then expand throughout the world. And in chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, he proves all that in Daniel's time, in history. You remember the story in chapter 3 especially. Nebuchadnezzar sets up this image of gold, demands all his subjects to bow down and worship. But Daniel's compatriots, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they refuse to bow down. Nebuchadnezzar pulls them in, asks them what their answer might be for refusal to comply with the divine decree. And here's what they say in Daniel 3, verses 17 and 18. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. This is their faith. They believe God will step up and he will deliver. But even if he doesn't, he's still God. Nebuchadnezzar and his gods, no, they won't worship them. No, they believe that God is faithful, even if they don't understand his ways, even if they don't understand his timing. So what's the point? What's the big question? What's the big point of the picture here? I think it's this, that in the book of Daniel, God proves himself in history. He's proving this in history so that we're better prepared to trust him in the present and in the future. These stories, they all remind us, they prove that God shows up. This is the same God that's still here. He is there in our present, will be there in our future. We have confidence to know that we can trust him. He is always faithful. I hope God will encourage your heart with this message as we move forward in our study of Daniel. Come back next week where we begin to take a look at these images of the kingdoms. How do we interpret them? Until then, may God bless you.